Great, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for taking the time to spend with us and my great panel to talk about Power for Progress. As said, I'm the CEO of Nifio. We are a climate fintech. We have an asset management vehicle of 50 million in which we invest in SMEs across 20 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We combine intelligence with finance. We combine big data with deployment of capital. And so I'm thrilled to introduce the speakers to our panel today, who range from different backgrounds, coming from traditional transmission lines all the way to inclusive housing. And we're going to discuss in an open way about how to ensure progress for all and power for all. So I think I prepared a little story here. Africa's energy story is often told as a tug of war between fossil fuels and renewables, or between access and sustainability. But a real challenge is designing systems that deliver reliable, affordable power to all. And we need that all in once, and therefore we need all these panelists. So first up, I want to introduce Sharon Lee. She's a Senior Vice President at GemCorp Capital. Sharon manages private credit investment at GemCorp Capital. Yeah, please join us on stage. She helped the clean energy strategy take shape at GemCorp, including the Lake Turkana wind farm, which is one of Africa's largest renewable energy projects. So she's here to talk about what makes clean energy really bankable. Second on stage, I'd like to introduce to you Oladayo Williams. He's the Managing Director of the Tetracore Energy Group. Oladayo is both a commercial lawyer and a strategist driving gas to power and embedded energy projects in Nigeria. He's led multi-million-dollar transactions and champions gas as a transition fuel that can unlock industrial growth. Next up is Jacqueline Okeo, founder and CEO of Mzansi Clean Energy Capital, which is a blended finance vehicle like Nifio, and she's investing in utilities for affordable housing. She connects energy access and housing equity. She has a large experience in both the United States as in Africa, and she's here to tell us about how we turn power into a social investment story. And last up, we have Yusuf Umar, the MD and CEO of Ripple, part of the NSIA, the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. That's a 500 million renewable energy platform that he helped drive to create, amongst other things, Nigeria's largest solar plant, and shaped major industrial partnerships in the country, blending both public and private capital for impact. So across this table, we have the investor, the strategist, the inclusion advocate, and the institutional capitalist. I think it's a perfect mix to unlock what power for progress truly means.
Are you able to see the one?
Yes. So we'll start briefly with finance. As most of this is related to finance, what drives us is capital. What do we need capital to unlock projects, to unlock financial inclusion, to unlock progress? One thing that we see is that there's actually a lack of capital. And so what's blocking the capital? That's the theme of this first chapter of our panel. I'm asking you, is it risk policy, or is it just simply a pipeline of capital, like that dried up, that's not available? So Sharon, starting with you, Lake Turkana showed both a success and pain points in the past. It's a large wind farm in the north of Kenya. So how do we ensure that these large-scale renewables actually lower the electricity prices for customers? And is blended finance helping you to create that, or actually makes it harder?
Really good question. To be honest, it's quite a complex one in terms of how to lower electricity price for the end users, right? Because there's so many factors that come into play. Of course, you have the generation, which Lake Turkana can contribute to, and then you have the losses in transmission, have the and distribution handled to the customers, as well as kind of the overall scheme of things. So if we focus on the generation part for today, where Lake Turkana wind farm, we can proudly say Euro probably about 1 billion of savings on energy cost over the first 6 years of the wind farm, not to predict future, right? So that's quite a remarkable overall saving for the budget of the government, at least, which would hopefully filter through into the individual retail prices. But that is subject to the wider scheme, as I mentioned. That's on the generation side, but the government also have, or in general, many countries, not just Kenya, right? There's a challenge around not just renewables that are kind of built newly or recently, which are usually the most efficient in terms of generation cost. You also have legacy PPAs, and you also have kind of the maintenance baseload of the grid, which all kind of contribute to the overall cost. And then kind of question mark on how much government gets from industry versus retail, because typically you can get a bit different kind of regulatory regime on the two separate paths, and then that's kind of what feeds into the end consumer retail energy price. So on the first part, quite a complex question. There's definitely a lot of contributors to the energy price. Lake Turkana can proudly say that is contributing to it and to the lowering of the energy cost, but a lot kind of wider picture than that. To your point on blended financing, similar story, right? So whenever blended financing or whenever blended financing can contribute to lowering of the cost at each of those stages, it all adds into the mix. But then eventually, you kind of need each of those chain to be efficient in order to lower the overall energy price for the consumers and for the end users.
Perfect, thanks. So maybe over to you, Yusuf, on your take. I mean, Ripple is one of the boldest clean energy investment theses that are out there. What do you see? Is it a lack of bankable projects, or is it a lack of capital?
Thank you, Roland. So from my perspective, it's a combination of many things. Risk is definitely one of those, and bankability of projects as well, it's relative, yes, but I think it's an issue nonetheless. And that's why for us at Ripple, we're taking a very integrated approach, wherein we develop projects with a clear view as to how to finance them at construction investment stages. It's also very important that that leadership for these kinds of initiatives comes from the continent. We understand our risk. What's risky to an outsider looking in isn't necessarily what I would perceive or what I would consider as a risky venture. So that first mover, particularly by institutional investors, is very important. So as much as that paucity of capital, which is very available, doesn't flow into Africa, I personally would blame institutionals for not being that first mover in that particular space. The point Sharon made about energy being cheap or making energy cheap, I think is a very instructive point. But I have a different or a slightly nuanced view regarding cheap energy, as it were. Again, it's very relative, yes? If you subsidize energy for a very unproductive activity, then regardless, it's expensive, it's considered expensive. So what we try to do is seeing how we can activate the market, how we can make people a bit more productive so that they're able to afford it. I look at energy prices in Kenya or South Africa. They're at least 60 to 100% more expensive than they are in Nigeria. But Nigerians still consider what we pay as very expensive. So again, there's a lot of relativism in how we look at these markets. I think it's important that those closer to the transaction, closer to the market, take that leap and move. And it's, again, very important that there is that productivity underpinning energy, not energy for the sake of meeting targets like Mission 300, where you just have connections and you tick some checkbox and then you're all happy and have a big party. It's really about access that sustains, access that is enduring, as it were.
Yeah, perfect. That's interesting that you touch upon M300. So M300 has been announced, obviously, to reach 300 million of people without energy access by 2030. It will be a 50 billion vehicle, they say, including 300 million that's anchored now to, for example, off-grid. What do you think of that? Because you just mentioned, like, I'm looking for leadership from the continent. I'm looking for local institutional capital. If you don't mind me asking, like, what's your take on M300 then?
No, thank you. And again, I'll be very cautious here. But I think in general, it's a very laudable initiative. I would have wished M300 was started 10, 15 years ago. I love the traction that it's getting on the continent. I like the commitment that I'm seeing from the political class. I like things around, again, coming back to Nigeria, where my primary focus is how ambitious, how very thought through the national compact is for M300. What we are doing to support M300 is, again, in as much as there's a public government leg to these investments, there has to be private capital supporting that. And again, I see myself as Ripple as a pivot, pivoting between private and public sector. But in this case, as it relates to M300, we're firmly on the private sector leg. We launched a fund in March we announced a fund in March of this year with Africa 50 and SC for All, as well as the International Solar Alliance, to support M300. It is a modest $500 million facility that is, I mean, the instrument of choice is equity and quasi-equity instruments to drive the energy access story. But not just access for access' sake, access that endures, access that leads to a lot of productivity. So we're hoping that as we deploy this, and which we target first close for sometime in the next sort of 3 to 6 months, as we start to deploy, we're able to then attract investors that are perhaps on the continent elsewhere or outside of the continent, giving them that comfort to then come in.
Excellent. So saying 500 million is modest, that's music to my ears, right? So there is sufficient capital available, luckily.
In the context of what's needed, that's modest.
What needed, yeah. So what's needed, then maybe we shift over to what is needed. What do we build with all this capital that will come in, that is available? I think I've been working into this sector for 15 years, and ever since, everybody's been talking about leapfrogging, right? Like the landlines, everybody's using mobile phones, banking accounts, everybody's using mobile phones. Distributed energy will allow us to leapfrog old transmission lines. Do we think that Africa actually can skip these lines, or do we still need wires? Talking to you, I think, Oladayo.
All right.
From your experience, like distributed models like CNG or LNG hubs, even mini grids, they replace the national transmission lines more and more. What do you think? Does industry still need a backbone grid?
Thank you very much, Rolando. I think that's an interesting question. For me, I think it sits at the interface between and the intersects between economic growth and energy access. And the simple answer, of course, is that distributed networks hasn't really come to replace or displace your traditional grids. If anything, I think it has come to complement it. And any country who is very serious about its industrial growth will tend to realize that. The fact is that for your traditional transmission networks and your national grid, that capacity to be able to deliver large distribution capacity across and support industrial growth is one that is very important. But beyond that is the fact that because of the epileptic nature of the grids, I mean, if you look at the grids in Nigeria, for example, that has had several downtimes over time, you then realize that it creates a case base for distributed networks so that it can come to reduce that over-reliance and burdening on the transmission networks and create a sort of energy inclusion and energy mix that helps to support sustainable energy solutions within the country. And that's something that's already been understood by a lot of countries. I mean, look at Kenya, for example, actively developing a lot of off-grid power solutions. You look at a country like Nigeria also, where a lot of states are beginning to operationalize the energy law that gives them that independence to be able to deliver generation, distribution, and transmission infrastructures within their region. And then you see that with doing that, you're able to not only support the national grid as we currently have it, but also deliver energy in such a way that recognizes the peculiarities of whether the rural areas, the underserved areas, and even the low-income areas. So, and with that sort of energy mix, you're then able to introduce gas-to-power solutions, renewable solutions, solar solutions, deployable within very short time, as opposed to when you have to do major overhaul or construction of a traditional transmission grid. So again, like I say, I don't think that the question is one of centralized versus distribution. If anything, I think that it should be an hybrid structure where we have on one end the transmission networks, we have the traditional transmission grid, which is also very important for that level of redundancy that you need within the electricity market. But beyond that, also having distributed and fragmented generation and transmission networks around, such that you can complement it, reduce that overburdening of the transmission network, and create a very sustainable energy solutions within your country. I think that's the way to go, as opposed to a competitive bid between distribution and distributed networks and your traditional grid.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. I think that it's not an either or, it's an and. There's this backbone, which is like the vein of the economy, and then for the more rural patches or for areas where it's more difficult to be reached, you can build it up from the ground up, decentralized. Then, if you don't mind me asking, because we've been seeing a lot of capital flowing in for renewable energy, especially from Europe, where we sometimes feel that we should dictate what can and cannot be done. Do you see capital drying up for gas to power, for example? Like where do you get the capital still to build this backbone infrastructure?
Thank you. I think we have to come to a reality, and the reality is the fact that for all players within the gas to power space, we compete with other, if I should put that in quotes, other cleaner sources of energy that the world is currently promoting, the likes of renewables, hydrogen, and all. And the fact still remains that by the time you look at the percentage contribution to emissions within Africa, you will see, and compared to other contributors within the world, you see that it sits at a very minor percentage. And by the time you then double that with the overaching gas reserves that Africa has, plus the demand for power, which is at a very high scale in Africa, you realize that what we need to do is to continue to develop our resources, our infrastructures, to be able to meet our energy deficit. However, we cannot detach ourselves from that realities, like I said earlier. So it becomes important that whilst we continue to crave financing in excess of $300 billion, and maybe I'll come to you soon very soon to ask for some money, but while we crave that much financing to meet our gas to power initiatives, we also have to then be able to implement some level of technology within our production mix that keeps our emissions at a very reduced state. So a lot of technologies are currently being promoted, carbon capture, for example, that is able to, clean up the production value chain within your gas to power facilities, such that you can, whilst you continue to leverage your resources, also meet that global shift towards clean sources of energy. DFIs will continue to play a very important role, obviously. Being closer to home, the likes of AFSIC, AFD are able to understand the peculiarities of the African energy sector, support that growth, whilst also creating that level of risk mitigants that allows international funding financing partners to understand that, yes, Africans are actually working and putting their mouth in the right direction.
Thank you. I think that's a very nuanced way to look at things, a much needed counterbalance to maybe the more positive stories. Coming over to you, Jacqueline, because we discussed decentralization where needed, decentralization where needed. Talking about affordable housing, what does leapfrogging look like in that sense? And can communities be self-powered without fragmenting a national grid?
Sure. Well, thanks for the question, Roland, and it's great to be here on the panel today. But maybe let's break down that question into two. Let's deal with the issue of leapfrogging first in affordable housing. So I think it's also important to contextualize the market in which we are working. We are in Africa. We also do some consulting work in New York, working with the New York State Energy Office around affordable housing decarbonization. So we are seeing a lot of the challenges that market is facing and looking at the opportunities also for our African market to transition. And this is really where our fund is playing. But if we contextualize the issues that we are facing on the continent, where the demographic issue, where more than the population will double by 2050, and then also there's significant rapid urbanization. So by 2050, 60% of the population will be living in the cities. So this creates a significant opportunity to discuss infrastructure that has not even been built. So we are talking about housing that doesn't even exist because the demographic is still expanding. So we need to think strategically about how we are going to focus on adaptation as opposed to mitigation. Whereas people outside of the African region, people in the West, New York, for example, is thinking more about mitigation because a lot of their infrastructure is old. So they're looking more at retrofitting technologies, which is very expensive, has a lot of institutional issues around mobilizing stakeholders to actually adopt a lot of these clean energy systems and transitions. Whereas in Africa, because our market is relatively young, and a lot of the people that we are still trying to accommodate, a lot of the buildings that we are still yet to build a lot of the infrastructure that we still require, we can have conversations around adaptation. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that, you know, when you look at the African continent, half of the countries don't even have building codes. So you have developers that are constructing and developing, but are not being regulated. So when you talk about leapfrogging, we have to think about how these systems are actually tying in. And then also we talk about the decarbonization roadmap, which is a roadmap that now talks to mitigation and adaptation. This is really how we are financing this program, puts together a timeline, it puts together who the key stakeholders are. Only 4 countries on the continent actually have a decarbonization roadmap. So that, you know, when we're talking about leapfrogging, we really have to contextualize the market in which we are working with and actually understand the challenges that are existing in the market. So these are key items that we need to think about. And then when we look at the issue of off-grid systems and fragmentation, I mean, in a market like South Africa, which is where the first phase of our fund is focused on, we are seeing that, you know, in the recent years, in the past 4 years, the electricity markets have been deregulated, so a lot of private sector entities have entered the market, you know, so a lot of IPPs have come into the market. Municipalities also are trying to build up their capacity, but are struggling to raise financing to expand the grid. And even the national utility is struggling to raise financing to be able to invest in the upkeep of their infrastructure. So private sector plays a very critical role to step in through these small-scale embedded generation systems, step in and actually provide some capacity to the municipalities to help them beef up the infrastructure. And so we are actually, interestingly, working on a pilot together with the Global Buildings Performance Network and the South African National Energy Development Institute, where we are developing a pilot from a pipeline where we will be doing an evidence building case that helps municipalities with evidence building and making recommendations on how they can standardize their municipal grid access requirements for small scale embedded projects that are coming from affordable housing. So we want to see how we can help to replicate and scale these types of projects across the country, because each municipality is also different. Each municipality has different capacity constraints. So it's important to help different municipalities, smaller municipalities build capacity to work with the private sector. So this is how we don't fragment the grid through these systems.
Perfect, thank you. Very interesting. So you're talking about like a lot of clean energy, private sector and capacity constraints, right? I mean, I think it was last week that the Financial Times reported that there's a record import of solar panels right now. Lower prices out of China mostly are flooding the continent, the article said. So flooding is kind of negative. My question is, like, is this a good thing or bad thing? Is it megawatts piling up, or is it transitioning into real impact? So Yusuf, what's your view on that? Do we have sufficient grid integration? Yeah.
I think I'm very excited at the trajectory of this conversations on this panel. I mean, you attend a lot of these things, and it's almost as if they're trying to sort of groupthink people into this tug of war between decentralized and decentralized system. But I mean, Jacqueline Oladayo, they couldn't have said it better, that it has to be a complementary relationship between the two. This is what's happening in Nigeria at the moment, yes? There are grid constraints in Nigeria, but right now, during peak sunlight hours, there's a significant dip in demand from the national grid. And what that happens is it weakens the systems, it then puts the national grid in jeopardy of collapse because there isn't enough pull on what it's able to supply. In as much as there is a focus on having a bit more generation capacity all around, it has to be in a very stepwise, in a very methodical fashion. Otherwise, as you're trying to build up these decentralized systems, you're crushing the backbone of the energy system. So it has to really be hand in hand. It has to be a very regulated, well, I use very regulated loosely here, but there has to be some thinking, some concerted efforts in ensuring that that doesn't happen. One doesn't crash because of the other. I have seen very similar conversations regarding types of financing where, because Nigeria is coming from and I think a lot of sub-Saharan African economies coming from a position of having, they bore the brunt of devaluation, and as such, foreign exchange debt facilities were a burden to the economy, to a push for local currency. But again, I look at the market in Nigeria at the moment, local currency pricing doesn't work. So if I were to take a facility for a large-scale project, I would most likely source it in hard currency. But because they've sort of demonized that type of financing, investors don't even think about it. So it's the same thing that's happening between decentralization and the national and the central system. And rather than getting a decentralized system, you're now getting a fragmented system, which is far worse. Now back to your question, forgive my rant, back to your question on sort of the record number of importation. So I think it's a good thing, at least people are getting a bit more savvy, a bit more aware, taking their energy story in their hands, and it's opening up a bigger market. But what we also have to do is, and I say this in various fora, that we have to also, as Africans, as contributors, particularly in these extractive industries, we have to, as much as possible, retain that value on the continent. We have to see a bit more industry around solar PV assembly, backward integrating to manufacturing. We have to see a bit more around the battery storage systems and all of that. You look at a government tender or any other tender, and it says it has to meet XYZ specifications, warranties of so years. If I import panels from China, that has a 10-year warranty, it is very unlikely if anything goes wrong, I'm able to export it, send it back. Many of these OEMs don't have a presence on the continent. So that warranty, for all intents and purposes, is just there for show. And if something then happens with a battery system or inverter, for instance, because you don't have capacity, you don't have expertise, it's very difficult to fix those things. But if we start to prop up industries that are able to assemble these things, that are able to understand these systems, then it becomes better. You see systems, and I mean, I've seen in a previous life when I was heading the NSIA's gas-based industries portfolio, you find large-scale gas industries that are not working to capacity. Why? Because it's technology from Asia, from the Middle East, from Europe, where the ambient conditions are very different from what you would find in country. And I mean, as you're able to reverse engineer these things, as you're able to get capacity on the continent, you're then able to at least create value and retain value on the continent. So yes, it's good that these things are happening. Importation is happening. We're embracing clean technology, but it's equally important that we build capacity and retain that value on continent.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's massively important to have that capacity building, and again, in a more broad stroke than just doing some development or some training here and there. Is that something that you see as well, Sharon? Like, well, it's not your words, but like cheap tech is not sufficient on its own, right? Especially in these markets, it might be very tough to monetize that. How do you assess solar in general in your portfolio?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and also a really, really good point. I totally resonate that the local grid or kind of mini grid and versus national transmission line really need to work together. And really interesting point on kind of local industry as well. I think one thing to add, if I may, is also on the design part, right? Because as you mentioned, quite often the design of the the design of the generation, be it solar, be it wind, etc., quite often is based on European experience or Chinese experience or wherever the mass industry is. But if you have more kind of local knowledge around the continent, or in particular, or in conditions like this, that would really facilitate both the capacity and also kind of local content or local expertise going up. from that perspective. So I guess to answer your question, we see a lot of solar potential in Africa, right? So I think, was it over 60% of the world's best solar sources in Africa, if I remember correctly? So that's definitely, huge potential in terms of not just powering the continent, but also potentially powering the rest of the world as well, right? Once you have the transmission line kind of overseas building up eventually as a kind of ultimate picture of the world, that's really one of the central battery source of the world, of the Earth. And I guess going back down from the big picture, in terms of individual solar projects, we see a lot in Africa. Monetization, I mean, yes, there are lots of challenges to that, but in general, there are plenty of bankable projects, right? And the kind of cost of solar panel, of course, actually reduction of the cost of solar panel in the recent years certainly facilitated that. Still challenges around logistics and etc., but definitely getting towards the right direction. And with the kind of more localized design or assembly and kind of construction, etc., that all contribute to that kind of bankable project supply chain as well.
Perfect.
Not sure if that answered the question.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Coming over to you, Jacqueline, listening to this, investors will naturally favor commercial, industrial, large projects. How do we ensure that these cheaper solar panels also drive your inclusive access and have the investment base for that?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think also just to maybe touch on one of the points that Yusuf made earlier, where you're talking about electricity prices in South Africa being 60% higher than what you have in Nigeria. I mean, the risk that is posing is that low to moderate income households are actually being left behind the clean energy transition. Right. So market rate residential tenants who can afford to transition to clean energy, and commercial and industrial suppliers, those are the folks who are taking advantage of a lot of the renewable energy finance, renewable energy incentives that are out in the market, and households that are low to moderate income are being left behind. Mm-hmm. And so this is really where we have to intervene, and this is really the market opportunity that our fund has seen and is working to capitalize, where we're working with affordable housing landlords to unlock concessionary capital as well as commercial capital to invest in clean utility projects that are targeting this market segment. But to come to your point around how do we make sure that households are not being left behind, the concessionary capital that we are unlocking is very critical. It is critical not only in terms of helping to de-risk and identify pipeline for funds, which a lot of funds are doing, which is fantastic, but it's also very important to utilize that capital as what we call to provide credit enhancement to the portfolios. So we want to direct more institutional investments into clean energy projects that are targeting low to moderate income households, because institutional investors don't want to touch this. So we want to make sure we are utilizing credit enhancements to actually direct a lot of, crowd in a lot of commercial and private capital into that segment. And then also we're wanting to utilize that to bring down the costs of these projects. So also to make the projects very affordable for the households. We cannot be utilizing, unlocking concessionary capital and then not passing on that benefit to the end users. And then also, traditionally the way projects are being structured is the traditional IPP, where the off-taker is taking up a lot of the risk. This type of project structures do not work for the sector. So we really need flexible off-take agreements where we rethink risk distribution, where landlords and tenants are not having to sit with all of the off-take risk. So making sure that the risk is appropriately allocated. And then just a final point around how we are utilizing this concessionary financing is to also develop a holistic ecosystem approach. We mentioned local value creation, so that local workforce, green skills workforce development, very, very, very much fundamental. In terms of how we are utilizing the TA facilities. We really need to make sure that the communities that we expect to adopt a lot of these technologies actually are employed in these projects, actually can find employment opportunities and are developed in terms of the skills that are required to maintain and sustain these projects. We also need to make sure that the consumers are aware of these technologies that we are introducing, and there's buy-in, and we understand how they are planning on utilizing what is really happening in their households. So let's not design for the consumer without having the consumer at the table. And then finally, the tech and manufacturers. I mean, there are so many different technologies being researched and developed here on the African continent as it relates to clean energy. But what the US, I believe, is doing well, and also we've seen the West, they're getting behind key technologies like the heat pumps. And those are the technologies that they're really looking to scale. Manufacturers can then hone in on these technologies, and we look at how we can bring down those costs. In Africa, I wouldn't be able to tell you what is the key technology that we're looking to scale in affordable housing when we talk about decarbonizing the built environment. Is it solar? Is it heat pumps? We are not quite sure. So we need to really get behind specific technologies, and government and manufacturers need to be able to push those technologies forward. And just a final point is around the policy incentives to transform the market. This is where government comes in. They can then pump in those policy incentives into those key areas that we have discussed, to be able to catalyze market transformation and be able to stimulate demand for the sector.
That's a lot to take in altogether.
Yeah.
Maybe finalizing on your last point on policy, because we've learned about capacity building, picking key technologies. Olade, you are very close to regulators. You have a lot of experience. So if we talk about this policy, what do you think? What should regulators do to make smaller and community-scale energy projects more bankable? And in general, what could regulators do for us to achieve these goals and all these big objectives?
Thank you very much, Roland. I should say that for me, I think the buck starts and stops at the table of the regulators. And any country who is, of course, interested in getting in investment will tend to realize this. One thing I say is that over the years, and traditionally, the regulators in Africa has always taken the position of watchdogs, where they typically just develop policies, ensure compliance, and when they are not complied with, they issue strict sanctions. But over time, we've seen that has become quite counterproductive, and it's sort of pushed back investment in countries. And so we're seeing regulators now beginning to morph. We see regulators in Nigeria, for example, like the NMDPRA, the NUPRC, and even the NERC, now morphing to becoming business enablers as opposed to the traditional watchdogs, and just putting themselves down to understand the integrities of each scale of energy infrastructure development, whether it's from the micro or the macro level, whether it's mid, small scale, or even at the large scale. And they're beginning to become more practical in terms of policy formulation that speaks to the peculiarities of each of these scale of energy infrastructure development. And so I'll say that part of what needs to be done, of course, to be able to incentivize investment in small and medium scale and large scale energy infrastructure projects is to do a few things. Obviously, policy stability plays a very important role. As an investor, I want to be sure that if I'm coming into your region, putting in my resources, I want to have that clear-cut understanding of what your policy landscape looks like, whether it's on the fiscal regime, the commercial framework, or even just the tariff methodologies that speaks directly to my investment. So I want to also be sure that those policies and fiscals are one that are stable. And if I have a 10-year period for my investment, for example, I want to be sure that at least I understand clearly how the policy landscape will shift within that period of 10 years. And that gives me that level of confidence to be able to sink in investment in that region. That's on one side. But the other side is also acting as risk mitigant. I think it's important that regulators start to also put their money where their mouth is. Whether it's in terms of payment guarantees, partial risk guarantees, or even taking up minority equities in small and medium scale energy investments, it sort of gives investors the feelings that the regulators are also directly invested in building their energy infrastructure and in the projects, and it gives them some level of confidence. And the final thing would be then to also ensure that, to look at regulators in terms of developing the market itself. Over time, what we've seen is that investors are in a position to have to deal with all the challenges associated with their investment, whether it's from the host community or from even that ordeals and the regulatory ordeals to securing their approvals. And so what you want to see is a regulator that sits in as like a middleman, engaging with the host community on one end, if that is ever needed, with the investor, to creating that enabling environment for an investment to thrive. But also beyond that, even acting as as, or giving that level of directive in terms of where government policies would look and shift towards, over the course of a certain period, and just ensuring that regular communication between the investors and the regulators, such that they understand all the integrities that surrounds the local framework, whether it's from the community end, from the down to the government end, and ensuring that yes, they have clarities around all that policies where they shift towards. And then once you have that, you tend to see that you get more investor confidence in your region, you attract more investment, and then it just creates a sustainable energy environment for yourself.
Perfect. There's so many things I'd like to touch upon. Like you touched upon NERC, I wanted to talk about that, but I heard the bell, so we have just a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to open the floor to the audience. Yeah, we've discussed anything from leapfrogging to financing to regulators and what's needed. If you have any questions for any of the panelists, please let me know. Yeah, in the back. Can you please introduce yourself and keep it brief so we have as many questions as possible still? Because I see the other people already.
Kofi Macaulay, Freetown, Sierra Leone, Sewa Energy in Hydro. I heard all the discussions, it's quite a lot. But straight to mini grids and the national grid. How much studies are there, and with reference to the money it actually costs to put up these mini grids compared to if you actually relied on connecting directly to the grid itself? Because bearing in mind, you have a lot of subsidy in making the mini grids work. And plus, half of that money also goes to consultants. When you put all of that together and put the real money in what it will cost to actually get the grid going, I don't know how much review, how people look into it, or like somebody said once, the people on the golf course said, put it all in mini grids, that's where all the cash is going. Thank you.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but Oladeo, given your experience with transmission lines and mini grids, like, what's your view? Has this been discussed on the golf course, or?
Well, but I'll say that again. Maybe I'll leave Yusuf to discuss the numbers. But in terms of what it actually costs to set up a mini grid, I think overall it depends on the scale. And like I said earlier, what we've typically seen is that mini grids could take several forms. You could have your renewable generation infrastructures tied with, and I'll take a typical example from Nigeria. Currently, we have states that are developing independently from the normal transmission lines, their own distribution infrastructure. So what you typically see is that, and I'll give an example of my company. We're currently doing a distribution infrastructure within a state in Nigeria, where we're partnering with the government, the state governments, to develop a transmission line independently of the current existing distribution network. And what we've seen is that sometimes it's easier to do two things. You can either do your generation and latch on an already existing distribution infrastructure, pay a distribution use of system tariff, and use that to wheel your power down to your end user. But then you typically see that, and like I mentioned earlier, because you also don't want to get into the challenges that the transmission network has typically faced, you then want to phase your projects in such a way that you are independent totally from the grid. Which then makes it a question of scale. Are you looking at what capacity are you looking at? I typically advise that, especially for regions where you're just developing, you want to start with a small scale capacity. So you're looking like a 5-10 megawatts, for example, and testing the markets before you then start putting in additional resources into developing bigger scale energy. You can do a rule of thumb and say your generation infrastructure costs you maybe ₦1 billion per megawatt. But then you also have to then look at the cost of setting up your distribution line, which maybe for a 10 megawatts, you're looking at about $4, $5, $6 million, $7 million to be able to deliver that level of capacity. But ultimately, I think that it is not a one-cap-fits-all question as much as it is what kind of scale, what kind of generation or distribution facility you're looking at. Is it renewable? Is it gas to power? Because again, all the elements has to come into play. You also have to look at your cost of gas, which plays a very important role in determining what your overall capex will look like for your power projects. So it's all that elements has to be put together: your fuel source, the generation plants, and whether you need an independent distribution infrastructure or you're just going to latch on an existing one.
Thank you so much. we unfortunately need to wrap it up here to make space for the next panel. I think this is a great wrap up. There's not a silver bullet here. It will be tailored solutions, but at the same hand, I've heard a lot about how we can at least make blueprints for tailored solutions. So if we say these are regions that we will never be able to reach with transmission lines, these are the ones where heavy industry will come, so we will need some fossil fuel generation capacity. And let the investors not decide, but also the operators, the projects, and the countries, including regulators and investment authorities themselves.
Yeah.
I want a big round of applause for my panelists.